Did medieval women truly never leave their homes? Were they all uneducated and without any power? Did they just spend their days cooking and spinning, never having a thought of their own? Prepare to uncover shocking truths about everyday medieval women from roughly 500 to 1500 CE. Number 1. Medieval women had no voice or influence in society. For centuries, a persistent idea has floated around: medieval women were silent bystanders entirely without a voice in the grand tapestry of history. This image often paints them as meek, with no say in the decisions that shape their lives or the world around them. It suggests they were always seen and never heard, their opinions dismissed, their wisdom ignored. This common belief portrays a world where only men held the reins of power, conversation, and community leadership. It implies that women were absent from the debates, the agreements, and the very fabric of social interaction that defined medieval existence. But what if this widespread notion is a carefully constructed fantasy, one that overlooks a rich and vibrant history of female engagement and authority? What if, in fact, medieval women actively participated, influenced, and even governed in ways that deeply contradict this quiet stereotype? Digging into the historical record reveals a different picture entirely. Women, in various capacities, exerted significant influence across all levels of medieval society. Their voices resonated in royal courts, within religious institutions, and even in the bustling marketplaces and local communities. For instance, women of high social standing, like queens and noblewomen, were not merely decorative figures. They served as regents for their young sons, effectively governing kingdoms and territories for extended periods. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful queen of France and later England in the 12th century, actively participated in political affairs, including joining the Second Crusade. Her influence stretched across courts, shaping culture, literature, and even international relations. She commanded respect and wielded genuine political power, engaging in negotiations and making critical decisions that affected thousands of lives. Her life story is a testament to a woman who was anything but silent. Her presence at court was not just ceremonial, it was a force to be reckoned with, guiding policy and defending her children's rights. Beyond the thrones and castles, women's voices were powerful within religious establishments. Abbesses, the female heads of monasteries, held immense authority. They managed vast estates, sometimes controlling more land and wealth than many male nobles. They oversaw large communities of nuns, directed spiritual and intellectual pursuits, and often served as powerful patrons of art and learning. For example, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a visionary composer, philosopher, and medical writer whose influence spread throughout Europe. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering advice and even strong criticisms. Her written works, including theological treatises and scientific observations, were widely read and respected. She founded her own monasteries, demonstrating her administrative prowess and her ability to lead large institutions. Her voice was heard and sought after by the most powerful men of her era, illustrating a profound level of spiritual and intellectual authority. These abbesses were not just religious leaders, they were powerful administrators and cultural figures who shaped their regions. Even in everyday village life, women contributed significantly to community discussions and decision-making. While they might not have sat in formal governing councils, their opinions and experiences were crucial in family matters, neighborhood disputes, and the running of local economies. The women often managed households, which were complex economic units involving agriculture, craft production, and trade. Their practical knowledge of managing resources, raising children, and maintaining social harmony gave them a significant voice within their immediate communities. Records show women engaging in lawsuits, defending their rights in court, and even acting as witnesses. For example, medieval court rolls from places like England reveal numerous instances of women appearing before local courts, prosecuting cases, defending themselves against accusations, or testifying on behalf of others. These records demonstrate a legal presence and a clear willingness to use the available legal avenues to assert their rights and voices. They were not simply passive recipients of legal outcomes, they actively participated in the legal process. In the bustling urban centers, women played vital roles in the marketplace and guilds. Many women ran their own businesses, from brewing ale to selling textiles or foodstuffs. They were not merely assistants to their husbands, they were independent entrepreneurs who negotiated deals, managed finances, and trained apprentices. Their professional standing gave them a voice in economic affairs and guild meetings, even if their formal membership was sometimes limited. Records from cities like London and Paris show countless women listed as property owners, taxpayers, and business leaders. For instance, in 14th century Paris, women were prominent in various trades, including silk spinning, embroidering, and innkeeping. These businesswomen interacted daily with suppliers and customers, making their economic contributions and their voices in trade matters undeniable. Their success depended on their ability to negotiate, persuade, and manage, all activities that require a strong and clear voice. Women also found ways to express themselves and influence society through artistic and literary means. Christine de Pizan, a professional writer in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, challenged prevailing misogynistic views and argued for women's intellectual and moral equality. Her works, such as The Book of the City of Ladies, were widely read and influential, advocating for a reevaluation of women's place in society. She earned her living by writing, a profession that required a powerful voice and the ability to articulate complex ideas. Her intellectual independence and her critiques of societal norms demonstrate a woman who very deliberately used her voice to challenge the status quo and to shape public discourse. Similarly, troubadour women, known as traubarites, composed and performed poetry in Occitan courts during the 12th and 13th centuries. They expressed their own perspectives on love, politics, and daily life, adding their unique voices to the vibrant literary traditions of the time. These women created art that reflected their experiences and contributed to the cultural landscape. The notion that medieval women were voiceless also ignores the significant roles women played in patronage. Powerful women often commissioned works of art, architecture, and literature, thereby shaping cultural trends and supporting artists and scholars. Their choices influenced what was created, preserved, and disseminated. This form of patronage was a powerful way of expressing their tastes, values, and even political statements. For example, Marie de Champagne, a 12th century countess, was a major patron of literature and a daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. She supported writers like Chrétien de Troyes, influencing the development of Arthurian romances. Her patronage gave her a direct hand in shaping the narratives and ideas that permeated her aristocratic circles, demonstrating a significant cultural influence through her choices and resources. Even within the domestic sphere, often seen as a place of female confinement, women's voices were paramount. They managed large households, a task that required significant administrative and managerial skills. This included overseeing servants, managing food supplies, and organizing family finances. Their decisions within the household had direct economic and social consequences. They were the primary educators of young children, passing on values, skills, and knowledge that shaped future generations. This role as a primary educator and moral compass within the family unit gave them a profound, if sometimes subtle, influence on the development of individuals and the transmission of culture. Their voices, heard daily by their families and servants, were central to the functioning of medieval domestic life. Furthermore, women were key figures in popular religious movements and local charitable efforts. They organized confraternities, joined pilgrimages, and played active roles in parish life. Their spiritual devotion often translated into community action and social influence. For instance, women were often the backbone of local charities, caring for the sick, the poor, and the elderly. And their compassion and organizational skills ensured that these vital social services were maintained. Their engagement in these public acts of faith and charity gave them a visible and respected presence in their communities, allowing their voices to be heard in advocating for those in need and in shaping the moral landscape of their localities. Their presence in religious processions and public acts of penance further showcased their public voice and devotion. The persistent myth of the voiceless medieval woman collapses when faced with the diverse and undeniable evidence of their active participation and influence. From queens governing kingdoms to abbesses leading intellectual centers, from businesswomen managing urban commerce to peasant women engaging in local disputes, medieval women found and used their voices in countless ways. They wrote, they administered, they advocated, they created, and they debated. Their contributions shaped their families, their communities, and their world. The historical record is filled with examples of women who spoke, acted, and left indelible marks on their societies, proving that the idea of a universally silent medieval woman is far from the historical truth. Their stories are not whispers lost to time, but vibrant narratives of agency and impact, revealing a complex and often powerful reality for medieval women. Number 2, medieval women were dirty and never bathed. A common idea about medieval women is that they were perpetually dirty, rarely if ever bathing, and generally lived in unsanitary conditions. This notion often conjures images of unkempt individuals covered in grime, living in a constant state of discomfort. It suggests that hygiene was a foreign concept, a luxury unknown or unpracticed in the medieval period, especially by women. This myth often ties into broader misconceptions about the entire medieval era being inherently primitive and lacking in basic cleanliness. The idea that women, In particular, neglected personal hygiene is a particularly persistent stereotype, sometimes implying a lack of self-care or an indifference to appearance. It paints a picture of a time utterly devoid of the bathing rituals and personal care practices we associate with modern life. But is this unflattering portrait truly accurate, or does it overlook the diverse and often sophisticated hygiene practices that existed for medieval women across different social strata? Historical records reveal a far more nuanced reality regarding medieval hygiene. While it certainly differed from modern practices, cleanliness was not universally neglected, and bathing was a known and practiced activity for many, including women. For instance, public bathhouses were common in many medieval cities, particularly in the early and high Middle Ages. These communal bathing facilities were popular social spaces where people of all classes, including women, could go to wash. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence had multiple public baths. Records from 14th century Paris show over 24 public bathhouses. These establishments offered warm water, sometimes even scented oils and massages, and were frequented by both men and women, though often with separate facilities or designated times. The existence of these commercial operations demonstrates a demand for bathing and a societal understanding of its importance. Women visited these baths for cleanliness, but also for social interaction and relaxation. Beyond public baths, personal washing was a regular practice, especially for the wealthier classes. Noblewomen and ladies of the court had access to private bathing facilities, including large tubs and heated water. And daily washing of hands and face was common, and full body baths were taken regularly, though perhaps not every single day. For instance, household accounts and medical texts often mention the use of basins, pitchers, and soap for personal hygiene. Soap, made from animal fats and plant ashes, was known and produced throughout the medieval period. Records from aristocratic households show purchases of soap, indicating its regular use. A lady's maid would assist her mistress with washing, often providing warm water in a portable tub or basin. This level of personal care, while not necessarily daily full immersion for everyone, was a routine part of upper-class life. Religious orders also emphasized cleanliness, particularly for nuns. Monastic rules often included provisions for bathing and personal hygiene as part of maintaining a clean and ordered life, both spiritually and physically. Nuns were expected to maintain a certain standard of cleanliness within their convents, which included personal washing. Their living quarters often had access to water for washing, and specific times might have been allocated for bathing. For example, the Rule of St. Benedict, which guided many monastic communities, emphasized cleanliness and order, implicitly encouraging good hygiene. Nuns were involved in the preparation of medicinal herbs and salves, which further connected them with practices of bodily care. Even among ordinary people, a focus on cleanliness, especially for specific occasions, was present. Before religious festivals, weddings, or other important events, people would often make an effort to be clean. These basins of water were common in homes for hand and face washing, particularly before meals. While a peasant woman might not have had a large personal tub, she would still have access to rivers, streams, or wells for washing herself and her clothes. Clothes were washed regularly, and efforts were made to keep living spaces tidy, especially around food preparation areas. The concept of cleanliness is next to godliness was a medieval adage reflecting a cultural value placed on purity. Medieval health manuals, like those written by Trotula of Salerno, contained advice on bathing, skincare, and hair care, demonstrating a clear awareness of personal hygiene and beauty practices. Furthermore, medieval people often used various substances for personal hygiene beyond just water and soap. Herbs, oils, and perfumes were utilized for cleaning, moisturizing, and scenting the body and hair. For example, rose water was commonly used as a facial cleanser and perfume. Various herbal concoctions were used for washing hair and conditioning the skin. People would often brush their teeth with rough cloths or abrasive powders made from herbs or bone. These practices, while not always identical to modern routines, indicate a deliberate effort to maintain personal freshness and appearance. The notion of a completely unwashed population ignores the use of these common ingredients and methods. The stereotype of medieval dirtiness also sometimes conflates sanitary conditions with personal hygiene. While urban sanitation systems were indeed rudimentary by modern standards, leading to issues with waste disposal and public health, this does not automatically mean individuals did not wash themselves. Many medieval homes, especially those of the wealthy, had sophisticated water systems and latrines. Even in simpler homes, privies or cesspits were common, and efforts were made to dispose of human waste, even if not always effectively. The challenges of urban sanitation were largely systemic, rather than a reflection of individual indifference to personal cleanliness. People understood that foul odors and visible grime were undesirable, and they took steps to address these issues within the technological and cultural constraints of their time. Consider the role of clothing. While not always washed with the same frequency as today, clothes were often made from natural fibers like linen and wool. Their linen undergarments, worn next to the skin, were frequently changed and washed, absorbing sweat and oils and helping to keep the body cleaner. His outer garments might have been brushed or aired out, but the undergarments were the primary layer for absorbing grime and were subject to more frequent washing. This practice of wearing and washing undergarments was a crucial part of medieval personal hygiene. The idea that medieval women were always unkempt and unconcerned with their appearance is also challenged by evidence of fashion and beauty practices. Medieval women across social classes valued appearance. They styled their hair, used cosmetics, and adorned themselves with jewelry. This attention to aesthetics suggests a foundational level of personal cleanliness. It would be illogical to meticulously style hair or apply makeup if the body itself was neglected. For example, illuminations in medieval manuscripts often depict women with neatly styled hair and clean appearances, reflecting an ideal but also a reality that women strived for. Hair, combs, and mirrors were common personal items, indicating care for personal grooming. The myth of the dirty medieval woman, especially the medieval woman, is largely a product of later historical biases and a romanticized view of the past. It overlooks the diverse and often sophisticated hygiene practices that were very much a part of medieval life. From public bathhouses to private washing routines, from the use of soap and herbs to the regular changing of undergarments, medieval women, like their male counterparts, engaged in a variety of practices to maintain personal cleanliness. Their approach to hygiene was practical and adapted to their environment, and it was certainly not characterized by universal neglect or indifference. They understood the importance of cleanliness for health, comfort, and social acceptance, and they acted upon that understanding in their daily lives. Number 3, medieval women were always passive and submissive. The popular image of medieval women often portrays them as entirely passive, perpetually submissive figures who simply accepted their lot without question or resistance. This pervasive myth suggests that women in the Middle Ages had no agency, no individual will, and certainly no capacity for defiance or leadership. It depicts them as meek, quiet individuals whose lives were entirely dictated by the men around them, from fathers to husbands to male authorities. This narrative implies a complete absence of independent thought or action, presenting a world where women were uniformly oppressed and never challenged the status quo. The idea of a woman standing up for herself, making her own decisions, or taking on a position of power often feels alien to this common understanding of the medieval period. But is this one-dimensional portrayal truly reflective of the lived experiences of medieval women, or does it dramatically underestimate their strength, resilience, and capacity for active engagement in their own lives and the world around them? Historical evidence tells a very different story, one filled with examples of medieval women who were anything but passive. From queens wielding political power to ordinary women asserting their rights in court, medieval women demonstrated remarkable agency and often defied expectations. For instance, queens like Matilda of England in the 12th century actively fought for their rights to the throne. Matilda engaged in a prolonged civil war, known as the Anarchy, against her cousin Stephen for the English crown. She personally led armies, negotiated treaties, and endured sieges. Her tenacious struggle for power shows a woman who was a powerful political and military leader, not a passive bystander. Her refusal to back down in the face of immense pressure illustrates a strength of will and a determination that shatters any notion of inherent female passivity. Beyond the battlefield, women exercise significant influence in various aspects of society. Within royal courts, noblewomen were often key players in diplomacy, patronage, and political maneuvering. They acted as intermediaries, arranged marriages to secure alliances, and managed vast estates in the absence of their husbands. For example, Blanche of Castile, Queen Regent of France in the 13th century, effectively governed the kingdom during the minority of her son, Louis IX. She skillfully navigated political crises, suppressed rebellions, and successfully guided France through a period of stability and growth. Her strong leadership and shrewd political acumen earned her the respect and sometimes fear of her male contemporaries. She was a formidable ruler, not a submissive figure. In the religious sphere, abbesses held immense power and influence. They managed large monasteries, which were often significant economic and intellectual centers. They oversaw vast landholdings, administered justice, and were often figures of authority in their local communities, even over male clergy and nobles. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, not only led her convent, but also corresponded with emperors, kings, and popes, offering strong opinions and advice. She founded new monasteries, demonstrating her capacity for independent action and large-scale administration. Her intellectual achievements and her willingness to speak truth to power reveal a woman who was assertive and influential, defying the stereotype of passivity. These women were leaders in every sense of the word. Even among ordinary women, examples of agency and defiance are plentiful. Women frequently appeared in medieval courts to prosecute legal cases, defend themselves against accusations, or represent their family's interests. They sought justice for wrongs committed against them, such as property disputes or assaults, and negotiated settlements. Records from manorial courts in medieval England, for example, show women actively participating in legal proceedings. They sued neighbors, defended their rights to land, and even brought cases against male relatives. This active engagement with the legal system shows that women understood their rights and were willing to assert them, rather than simply accepting their circumstances. Their presence in these courts demonstrates a refusal to be silenced or to endure injustice passively. Women also played significant roles in the economy, particularly in urban settings. Many women ran their own businesses, inherited trades from their husbands, or worked independently as artisans, merchants, or innkeepers. These women negotiated prices, managed employees, and made independent financial decisions. For instance, in medieval Paris, women were prominent in various trades, including brewing, silk production, and embroidery. They were responsible for their livelihoods, and often those of their families, demonstrating economic independence and assertiveness. Their success depended on their ability to act decisively and manage complex enterprises, traits that directly contradict the idea of passivity. A woman managing an inn or a brewing business was a proactive, decision-making individual. Beyond formal structures, women sometimes participated in popular uprisings and social protests. While often overlooked in historical accounts, women were present in crowds, participated in riots, and sometimes even led acts of resistance against authorities or oppressive conditions. For instance, during the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, women were documented as participants, taking part in acts of protest and even violence. Their presence in such events underscores their active engagement in political and social discontent, demonstrating a willingness to challenge authority and fight for change. These were not submissive figures, but individuals moved to action by perceived injustices. The idea of women's passivity also ignores their agency in personal matters, including marriage and family life. While arranged marriages were common, women often had some degree of influence, particularly in noble families where their consent, or at least acquiescence, was often sought to ensure family alliances. There are documented cases of women resisting unwanted marriages or seeking annulments. For example, medieval church courts heard many cases brought by women seeking to dissolve marriages on various grounds, including lack of consent or non-consummation. This demonstrates a clear understanding of their marital rights and a willingness to assert them, challenging arrangements that were not to their liking. Their ability to appeal to church courts for redress shows a sophisticated understanding of legal and social structures. The persistent myth of the passive medieval woman is a simplification that ignores the vast and varied experiences of women throughout the Middle Ages. From powerful queens and abbesses to assertive businesswomen and legal plaintiffs, medieval women frequently demonstrated agency, leadership, and a profound capacity for action. They navigated complex social structures, challenged norms, and actively shaped their lives and the world around them. Their stories are not uniform tales of submission, but diverse narratives of resilience, strength, and active participation. The historical record clearly shows that medieval women were not merely acted upon, they were actors themselves, capable of making decisions, influencing events, and standing up for what they believed in, proving that the stereotype of universal female passivity is a historical inaccuracy. Number 4, childbirth was always fatal for women. The grim image of childbirth in the Middle Ages is one that often dominates popular imagination, a scene of inevitable tragedy where women almost certainly perished in the act of bringing new life into the world. This persistent myth paints a picture of childbirth as a death sentence, implying that most women would die during their first or subsequent deliveries. It suggests a complete lack of medical knowledge or effective support during labor, leaving women entirely vulnerable to fatal complications. This narrative often contributes to a broader perception of the medieval period as uniformly brutal and short-lived, particularly for women. The idea that women face near certain death with every pregnancy is a deeply ingrained belief, shaping how many people view medieval female lives. But is this dire assessment truly accurate, or does it sensationalize a dangerous but often survived event, overlooking the realities of medieval health and birthing practices? While childbirth was undeniably risky in the medieval period, it was not always fatal for women. Many women survived multiple pregnancies and deliveries throughout their lives. The idea that most women died in childbirth is an exaggeration that is not supported by historical data. Infant mortality rates were indeed tragically high, but maternal mortality, while significant, was not universal. For instance, demographic studies of medieval populations based on records from manorial rolls, parish registers, and family chronicles show that while some women died in childbirth, the majority did not. These studies indicate that a woman's cumulative risk of dying in childbirth over her reproductive lifetime was substantial, but the risk for any single birth, while elevated compared to modern times, was not a near certainty of death. Women often had many children, a pattern that would be impossible if each birth carried an almost guaranteed fatal outcome for the mother. Medieval society had a structured system of support for women in labor, primarily centered around experienced female attendants. Midwives played a crucial role in assisting women during childbirth. These were often older women from the community who had experience with many births and possessed practical knowledge passed down through generations. They provided emotional support, comfort, and practical assistance during labor. Their expertise included knowledge of herbal remedies to ease pain or aid delivery and techniques for positioning the mother. For example, texts like the Trotula, a collection of medieval medical writings attributed to a female physician from Salerno in the 11th or 12th century, contain detailed advice on managing labor and delivery, including dealing with complications. This indicates a body of medical knowledge, however different from modern medicine, specifically dedicated to women's health and childbirth. Religious and communal support also played a vital role. Childbirth was often a communal event, with female relatives, neighbors, and friends gathered to support the laboring woman. Prayers and religious rituals were common, seen as a way to seek divine aid and comfort during the difficult process. The birthing chamber was a female-dominated space, offering a sense of privacy and collective female strength. The presence of multiple women rather than just one medical professional meant that various forms of assistance and comfort could be provided. This social support system was crucial for physical and emotional well-being during labor. Complications, when they arose, were certainly dangerous but not always insurmountable. Hemorrhage, infection, and prolonged labor were the primary causes of maternal death. However, medieval midwives and physicians did have some knowledge of how to manage these issues. For example, they might use herbal remedies to stop bleeding or to induce contractions. Some medical texts describe procedures for turning a breech baby, or even performing rudimentary surgical interventions, though these were rare and extremely risky. While medical science was far from modern standards, the understanding of the birthing process was based on extensive practical experience. Our records show, for instance, that many women survived difficult deliveries, even if the outcomes for the infants were less certain. The high rates of infant mortality often overshadow the maternal survival rates. Many babies did not survive infancy due to disease, poor nutrition, or complications during birth. This high infant death rate sometimes leads to the mistaken assumption that the mother also perished. However, a mother could survive a birth even if her child did not, and vice versa. It is important to distinguish between the fates of mother and child. Women often endured multiple pregnancies, sometimes up to 10 or more, which would have been impossible if each birth carried a near certain risk of maternal death. This reality of women bearing many children over their reproductive lives is a strong counter-argument to the myth of inevitable fatality. Moreover, a woman's social status and access to resources could significantly impact her birthing experience and survival. Noblewomen might have had access to better nutrition, more hygienic birthing environments, and more skilled attendants, though even they faced risks. Peasant women, while having less access to material comforts, were often in good physical condition from manual labor, which could sometimes aid in labor. The health of the mother entering pregnancy was also a significant factor. A healthy, well-nourished woman had a better chance of surviving childbirth than a malnourished or sickly one. This highlights that risk was not uniform across all women but influenced by various factors. The perception of medieval childbirth as universally fatal also neglects the everyday reality of life continuity. Societies continued, populations grew, and communities thrived, all dependent on successful births. If childbirth was always fatal, the social structure would have collapsed. The women were the primary childbearers, and their survival was essential for the continuation of families and lineages. This practical necessity alone suggests that the majority of births were indeed successful for the mother, even if challenging. The enduring myth of medieval childbirth being always fatal is an oversimplification that ignores the resilience of women, the knowledge of medieval midwives, and the historical demographic data. While undeniably dangerous and a leading cause of death for women of reproductive age, childbirth was not a guaranteed death sentence. Many women successfully navigated the perils of labor multiple times, contributing to the continuation of families and communities. The history of medieval women is filled with stories of survival and endurance, not just tragedy, in the face of this significant life event, proving that the idea of inevitable death in childbirth is a historical misrepresentation. Number 5, marriage was always forced and loveless. A prevalent belief about medieval women suggests that their marriages were universally forced, loveless arrangements devoid of affection or personal choice. This myth often paints a picture of women being mere pawns in dynastic games or property transactions with no say in who they married, and subsequently living out their lives in unhappy unions purely for practical or economic reasons. It implies that emotional connection, personal desire, or even simple friendship played no part in marital decisions or the daily realities of married life. This view can lead to a bleak understanding of medieval relationships, assuming that the concept of romantic love or companionate marriage was entirely absent from the era. But is this bleak portrayal truly accurate, or does it ignore the complexities of medieval marital practices and the diverse experiences of couples during that time? While arranged marriages were indeed common, particularly among the nobility and upper classes, medieval marriages were not always forced or entirely loveless. The degree of choice and the presence of affection varied significantly across social classes and over time. For instance, among the nobility, strategic alliances and property consolidation were often primary considerations for marriage. However, even in these cases, the consent of both parties, particularly the woman, was often sought or at least deemed important by the church. Canon law, which governed marriage in the Christian West, emphasized the voluntary consent of both the bride and groom as essential for a valid marriage. While this consent could sometimes be pressured, it still acknowledged the individual's role. Records show instances where individuals, including women, resisted unwanted matches, sometimes appealing to ecclesiastical courts. For example, a woman might argue she had been forced or that she had a pre-contract with someone else. For ordinary people, especially in peasant and urban communities, there was often more room for personal choice, or at least a negotiation of terms that included the prospective spouse's wishes. Marriages were still practical arrangements focusing on land, labor, or economic partnerships, but love and affection could certainly develop within these unions or even precede them. Young people in villages often had opportunities to meet and interact, sometimes leading to mutual attraction. The community elders and families still played a role in approving matches, but outright coercion was less common than in the highest echelons of society where political stakes were higher. Studies of medieval village life show instances of young people choosing their own partners, even if it meant economic hardship. Many medieval sources, including letters, poetry, and chronicles, provide evidence of affection and companionship within marriage. While the romantic love often depicted in modern media might not be the primary focus, concepts of love, respect, and mutual support were present. For example, numerous medieval letters exchanged between spouses, even those from politically arranged marriages, reveal genuine fondness, concern, and longing when separated. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II, despite their later conflicts, initially shared a passionate relationship. While their marriage eventually soured, it began with a strong connection that went beyond mere political alliance. Similarly, the letters between Margaret Paston and her husband John in 15th century England show deep affection, shared worries about their children, and practical cooperation in managing their estate, demonstrating a true partnership. The Church, through its teachings, promoted the idea of marriage as a sacred union, emphasizing fidelity and mutual respect between spouses. While it placed men as the head of the household, it also encouraged husbands to treat their wives with kindness and care. Sermons and religious texts of the time often exhorted couples to live in harmony and to love one another. The very concept of conjugal affection was acknowledged and often encouraged within the bounds of Christian marriage. For example, St. Augustine's writings, influential throughout the Middle Ages, acknowledged the importance of charity or love within marriage, not just for procreation but for companionship. Furthermore, medieval literature, while often stylized, also reflects the existence of love and attraction within marriage. While courtly love poetry often focused on extramarital affairs, other forms of literature, like chansons de geste and fabliaux, sometimes depicted marital relationships with warmth, humor, and mutual affection, even if they also satirized marital squabbles. The popular tales and songs that circulated in medieval society, when not focused on grand romantic gestures, often depicted the everyday realities of couples who lived and worked together, sharing their lives in ways that suggested genuine companionship. The narratives were not always about grand, idealized love, but about the practical and emotional bonds that formed over a shared lifetime. The practical realities of medieval life often necessitated cooperation and partnership within marriage. For many families, especially those involved in agriculture or crafts, the household was an economic unit where both husband and wife had defined interdependent roles. A successful household required mutual trust, respect, and joint decision-making. A husband who consistently mistreated his wife, or a wife who refused to cooperate, would undermine the family's economic stability. This practical interdependence often fostered a working relationship that could deepen into affection and companionship over time. For example, a peasant couple working a field together relied on each other's efforts and support for their livelihood. This shared struggle often forged strong bonds. The legal rights of women, while limited compared to men, sometimes offered avenues for recourse if a marriage was truly abusive or unwanted. Women could appeal to church courts for annulments or separations in cases of severe cruelty, impotence, or lack of proper consent. While not easy, these options demonstrate that women were not entirely without recourse against truly unbearable unions. The fact that such cases existed and were heard shows that individuals did challenge marital situations they found intolerable. The belief that medieval marriages were always forced and loveless is an oversimplification. While arranged marriages and practical considerations were undeniably important, personal consent was often a legal requirement, and affection and companionship frequently developed within these unions. Historical accounts, personal letters, and religious teachings all point to a more complex reality, where love, respect, and mutual support were present within medieval marriages, even if the definitions and expressions of these emotions differed from modern expectations. The medieval marriage was a multifaceted institution, and it contained within it the potential for genuine human connection, proving that the myth of universally loveless unions is a narrow and inaccurate portrayal. Number 6. All women were confined to the home and domestic duties. A widespread myth about medieval women is that they were universally confined to the home, their lives entirely dictated by domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, and childcare, with no role outside the household. This belief often conjures an image of women as isolated figures, rarely venturing beyond their front door, completely excluded from the public sphere, economic activities, or intellectual pursuits. It suggests that medieval society rigidly enforced a strict division of labor where women's work was solely internal, making them invisible in the bustling world of trade, craft, and agriculture. This pervasive idea contributes to a perception of medieval women as entirely dependent and economically inactive, limited to a private existence. But does this narrow portrayal truly reflect the diverse ways medieval women lived, worked, and contributed to their communities? The historical record provides abundant evidence that medieval women across all social classes were actively involved in a wide array of economic activities and public life, far beyond the confines of their homes. While domestic duties were indeed a significant part of many women's lives, especially for homemakers, they were by no means the sole or universal occupation. For instance, in rural areas, peasant women were indispensable to the agricultural economy. They worked alongside men in the fields, planting, harvesting, and tending livestock. They were involved in every stage of food production, from preparing the soil to processing crops. Beyond fieldwork, they managed gardens, raised poultry, milked cows, and produced dairy products like cheese and butter. Their labor was vital for the survival of their families and the wider community. Manorial records show women listed as agricultural laborers, paying rent, and even being involved in disputes over land, demonstrating their direct involvement in the economy. In urban centers, women were heavily involved in a variety of trades and crafts. Many women ran their own businesses or worked independently. For example, women were prominent as brewers, bakers, textile producers, embroiderers, innkeepers, and shopkeepers. Records from medieval cities like Paris, London, and Cologne show women registered as members of guilds, operating as independent masters of their crafts and training apprentices. The Guild of Silk Weavers in Paris, for instance, was almost entirely composed of women. These businesswomen managed finances, purchased materials, sold goods, and navigated the complexities of the marketplace. They were economically active, engaged in public commerce, and contributed significantly to the urban economy. Their workplaces were often extensions of their homes, blurring the line between domestic and public spheres. Beyond specific crafts, women were crucial to the functioning of local markets. They bought and sold goods, engaged in trade, and contributed to the vibrant economic life of towns and cities. Many women were involved in selling foodstuffs, such as eggs, poultry, and vegetables, often traveling to local markets to do so. They were skilled in haggling, negotiation, and managing transactions. Market records often list women as vendors and traders, demonstrating their active participation in the public sphere of commerce. This role required women to be visible, engaged, and independent in their economic dealings. Even within noble households, women's roles extended far beyond simple domesticity. Thus, noble women were often responsible for managing large estates in the absence of their husbands, overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents, and administering justice to tenants. They acted as powerful landowners and administrators, making significant economic decisions and interacting with a wide range of people outside their immediate family. For example, the Paston women in 15th century England, such as Margaret Paston, frequently managed their family estates and business affairs, corresponded with lawyers and merchants, and actively protected their family's interests in their husband's absence. Their letters reveal a deep involvement in the practical and financial aspects of running a complex medieval household, which was an economic enterprise. Women also played significant roles in service industries. They worked as domestic servants in wealthier households as laundresses, nurses, wet nurses, and bathhouse attendants. These were paid positions that took them outside their own homes and into the homes or establishments of others. Their labor was essential for the functioning of medieval society and economy. Wet nurses, in particular, lived away from their own families for extended periods, providing crucial care for the children of others. These roles illustrate that women's work was diverse and often required them to be in the public sphere, interacting with various individuals. Furthermore, women were deeply involved in religious life outside the home. Nuns lived in convents, which were complex institutions with their own economic, social, and spiritual functions. Abbesses, as mentioned earlier, managed vast estates and wielded significant power and influence in their regions. Other women engaged in pilgrimages, joined religious confraternities, or provided charitable services to the sick and poor in their communities. These activities took them into public spaces, churches, hospitals, and along pilgrimage routes, demonstrating an active public life centered around their faith. Their spiritual lives were often profoundly public and communal. The idea that medieval women were confined to domestic duties is largely a misconception driven by later Victorian ideals of womanhood, which emphasized the domestic sphere. Medieval society had different expectations and structures. While some women, particularly in the elite, might have been secluded for protection or status, this was by no means universal, and even for them, their roles extended to managing complex households that were significant economic entities. For the vast majority of women across Europe, work was a shared necessity, and their contributions to the economy, whether in the fields, the markets, or the workshops, were indispensable and highly visible. The historical evidence clearly shows that medieval women were not confined to the home. They were active participants in the economic, social, and religious life of their communities. They worked in fields, ran businesses, managed estates, and engaged in public commerce. Their labor was vital, their contributions indispensable, and their presence felt throughout medieval society, proving that the myth of universal domestic confinement is a profound misrepresentation of their lives. Number 7. Women had no legal rights or property ownership. A common perception of medieval women is that they possessed no legal rights whatsoever and were entirely incapable of owning property independently. This widespread myth suggests that women were always under the complete control of their male relatives, whether fathers, brothers, or husbands, making them perpetual legal minors with no autonomy over assets or personal decisions. It implies a societal structure where women were essentially property themselves, unable to inherit, manage, or dispose of wealth, thus rendering them entirely dependent and vulnerable. This narrative paints a bleak picture of women's economic and legal standing, assuming they were completely disenfranchised from the legal and property systems of the time. But is this stark portrayal truly accurate, or does it overlook the complex and often surprising legal realities that afforded medieval women various rights and opportunities for property ownership? The historical record demonstrates that medieval women, depending on their social status, marital status, and geographical location, held a surprising range of legal rights and could indeed own, inherit, and manage property. The idea of universal legal powerlessness is a significant oversimplification. For instance, unmarred women, including spinsters and widows, were considered femsole in English common law and similar legal traditions across Europe. As a femsole, a woman had significant legal independence. She could own property, enter into contracts, sue and be sued in court, and engage in business activities in her own name. Widows, in particular, often regained full control over their dower land, a portion of their deceased husband's estate, typically 1/3 in any property they brought into the marriage. This gave many widows substantial economic and legal power. For example, records show numerous widows managing large estates, running businesses, and participating in local governance. Even married women, or femme covert in English common law, who were legally considered one with their husbands, still retained certain rights and avenues for property ownership. While a husband typically managed the marital assets, a wife often had customary rights to her dower, which could not be alienated without her consent. She could also have property settled on her by her family that was meant to be separate from the marital assets, known as her paraphernalia or pin money. These separate assets could include clothing, jewelry, and sometimes even household goods that remain her personal property and could be passed down to her own heirs. Furthermore, in some regions, particularly those influenced by Roman law or specific urban customs, married women had more extensive rights to conduct business independently and own property separate from their husbands. For example, in many Italian city-states, married women engaged in trade independently, and their property was often protected from their husbands' debts. Inheritance laws varied, but women commonly inherited property, especially in the absence of male heirs or through specific legal instruments. Daughters could inherit land or movable property. While primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son was common for noble estates, daughters often received a dowry, a payment, or property given to the husband upon marriage or specific inheritances upon their father's death. In some systems, like Debunking in Kent, England, property was divided among all sons and daughters equally. The wills and testaments from the medieval period show women leaving property to their children, other relatives, and even to charitable institutions, demonstrating their ownership and control over assets. For instance, many noble women made detailed wills dictating the distribution of their wealth and possessions. Women actively participated in legal proceedings to protect their property rights. They frequently appeared in manorial, royal, and ecclesiastical courts to defend their inheritances, challenge unfair land dealings, or pursue claims related to debts and contracts. Records from medieval courts are filled with cases involving women as plaintiffs and defendants, indicating their legal standing and their willingness to use the legal system to assert their rights. For example, during the 13th and 14th centuries in England, court rolls reveal numerous instances of women suing for dower, disputing property boundaries, or enforcing agreements. Their active presence in these courts directly contradicts the idea of women being entirely without legal voice or rights. Beyond formal legal frameworks, women's property ownership was also recognized through customary practices and local traditions. In many communities, common law was supplemented by local customs that might grant women greater autonomy over property. These customs often reflected the practical realities of a community's economy and social structure. For instance, in towns where women were highly active in trade, local regulations often supported their ability to own and manage their businesses and property independently. The power of wealthy women, particularly queens and noblewomen, further illustrates this point. They often held vast estates in their own right, separate from their husbands, and managed them as independent lords. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, controlled significant territories and revenues in her own name, making her an immensely wealthy and powerful landowner. These women engaged in large-scale economic management, collected taxes, and administered justice over their lands, demonstrating property rights on a grand scale. The Church, through its canon law, also provided certain protections for women's property and legal standing. While deeply patriarchal in many respects, canon law sometimes offered recourse for women who felt their rights were being violated, particularly concerning marriage, inheritance, and protection from abuse. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases that involved women's property disputes and allowed women to make oaths and provide testimony, recognizing their legal personhood. The persistent myth that medieval women had no legal rights or property ownership collapses under the weight of historical evidence. While their rights were not identical to men's and varied significantly by time and place, women in the Middle Ages possessed a range of legal capacities. Unmarried women and widows had significant autonomy, and even married women retained certain rights over property and were able to engage in legal processes. The ability of women to inherit, manage, and defend their assets, and to participate in legal proceedings, demonstrates a far more complex and empowering reality than the common myth suggests. Medieval women were not simply devoid of legal standing. They navigated a system that, while imperfect, offered them various avenues to assert their rights and control their own wealth. Number 8. All medieval women were uneducated and illiterate. A widely held belief suggests that medieval women were universally uneducated and illiterate, with no access to learning or the ability to read and write. This myth often paints a picture of a society where knowledge was exclusively for men, leaving women in a state of intellectual darkness, confined to purely practical, non-intellectual pursuits. It implies that formal schooling or even basic literacy was utterly beyond their reach, making them incapable of engaging with texts, managing complex information, or contributing to intellectual discourse. This perception frequently leads to the assumption that medieval women played no role in the transmission of knowledge or the creation of literature. But does this broad generalization truly capture the reality of education and literacy among medieval women, or does it overlook a fascinating and varied landscape of female learning? Historical evidence reveals a far more nuanced picture of female education and literacy in the Middle Ages. While universal formal schooling for women, as we understand it today, was not common, many women across different social classes did receive an education and were literate. For instance, noble women were often educated at home by tutors, governesses, or chaplains. Their education typically included reading, writing, household management, religious instruction, and sometimes even Latin, French, music, and the arts. This education was considered essential for managing large estates, maintaining social status, and fulfilling their roles as wives and mothers in aristocratic households. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a 12th century queen, was known for her high level of education and her patronage of literature, indicating she could read and understand complex works. Similarly, women like Anne de Beaujeu, regent of France in the late 15th century, were highly educated in politics, history, and literature, enabling them to govern effectively. Within religious institutions, particularly convents, women achieved high levels of literacy and intellectual engagement. Nunneries were centers of learning where nuns were taught to read, write, and often master Latin, the language of scholarship and theology. They copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, composed music, and wrote theological and literary works. Abbesses, in particular, were often highly educated and managed extensive libraries. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a prodigious writer, composing works on theology, medicine, botany, and music, all of which required extensive literacy and intellectual training. Rotswit of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote plays and poems in Latin, demonstrating a profound classical education. These women were not only literate, but were active participants in the intellectual and cultural life of their time, directly contradicting the myth of universal female illiteracy. Even among urban women, literacy was more common than often assumed, especially for those involved in commerce. Daughters of merchants, artisans, and tradespeople sometimes received basic education in reading, writing, and arithmetic to assist with family businesses. They needed to keep accounts, write letters, and manage transactions. The guilds, which organized trades in medieval towns, sometimes had provisions for the education of daughters, particularly in crafts where women played a prominent role. For example, women involved in brewing, baking, or textile production often required at least functional literacy to manage their enterprises. Records from cities like London and Paris show women conducting business independently, which implies the ability to read and write agreements, receipts, and correspondence. While widespread literacy among peasant women was less common than among the nobility or clergy, it was not entirely absent. Basic literacy, such as the ability to read prayers or devotional texts, might have been acquired from local priests or traveling scholars. Practical literacy for specific purposes, such as understanding land agreements or basic calculations, could also exist. The increasing availability of vernacular texts written in local languages rather than Latin in the later Middle Ages made reading more accessible to a broader segment of the population, including some women from lower social strata. Your family members might teach each other, and some villages might have had rudimentary schools. The types of texts women read were diverse. Beyond religious texts like psalters, books of hours, and prayer books, women also read chronicles, romances, medical texts, and even legal documents. The popularity of devotional literature among women further demonstrates their widespread engagement with written material. Books of hours, personalized prayer books were common possessions for many noble and even some middle-class women, indicating their ability to read and engage with complex spiritual texts. Their existence and widespread use imply a significant level of female literacy for personal devotion. Furthermore, some medieval women were not just readers but also writers. Christine de Pizan, a professional writer in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, earned her living by writing, producing numerous works on history, philosophy, and women's rights. Her intellectual prowess and prolific output clearly demonstrate a woman who was highly educated and deeply engaged with the written word. Marie de France, a 12th century poet, wrote influential lays and fables, showcasing her literary skill and her active participation in the literary landscape. These authors represent the pinnacle of female literacy and intellectual achievement, but they also signal a broader environment where such accomplishments were possible. The presence of female scribes and illuminators in some monasteries and even commercial workshops further highlights women's literacy and professional engagement with texts. Nuns sometimes copied manuscripts, contributing to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. This work required not only literacy, but also a high degree of precision and skill in penmanship and artistic decoration. These roles demonstrate that women were actively involved in the production of written materials, not just their consumption. The myth of universal female illiteracy in the Middle Ages is a simplification that ignores the varied educational opportunities and achievements of women. From highly educated noble women managing estates and engaging in political life, to intellectual nuns producing scholarly works, to urban business women needing literacy for their trades, and even some peasant women acquiring basic reading skills for devotion or practical purposes, medieval women engaged with the written word in diverse ways. Their access to education and their levels of literacy were far more extensive and varied than the pervasive myth suggests, proving that the idea of universally uneducated and illiterate medieval women is inaccurate and overlooks a significant part of their rich history.